Hi guys, here I'm going to show you the difference between select and activate and selection and ActiveCell within macros in Excel. It can be kind of a confusing topic, so hopefully I'll be able to clear that up here. And this is part of a larger course that I'm now making for Teach Excel, and hopefully I'll have that done pretty soon. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to Teach Excel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. This tutorial deals essentially with highlighting cells within the worksheet. So the first part of the tutorial will be where we use a macro to highlight cells, and the second part will be to use a macro when a user has highlighted, selected, or activated cells within the worksheet. So I'm going to try and use highlight instead of the word selection or activate to make things a little bit less confusing, but I might dip into both. It's very easy to dip into both when you're talking, but let's try and clear up some of the confusion now. For the first part of the tutorial, it's going to talk about when we want to select or activate or highlight a cell within the worksheet using a macro. The basic premise, the basic idea is select is for multiple cells and activate is for single cells, a single cell. Now it's a little bit more complex than that, but that is the main idea, the main premise. And when you are using a macro to highlight cells, you will almost always use select. And that's why when you're learning about how to make range references, almost every tutorial, including mine, is going to usually use select to select the range reference instead of activate. So let's go through some of these examples so you can see how it works and see the differences. So first up, we're going to select cell A1. Let's go back to the worksheet, Alt F11 and Alt F8. Actually, let's select away from A1 now, Alt F8, and we want to go to activate or to select. And it's A1, just like if we'd clicked with our mouse. So select, as you'll see through the examples, is exactly the same as if you select a cell with your mouse. It's going to allow you to select a single cell or a range and then another range and then another cell. And I'm doing this right here just by holding the control key on the keyboard. But where the confusion comes in, let's comment this guy out so it won't run and uncomment the next one, is that activate seems to work quite a lot like select. So let's run it right now, and it's going to activate or select cell A1. All right, so which one do I use? Well, once we start to get to ranges, that's where it becomes more apparent. So let's select A1 to C3. A1 to C3, perfect. Now, let me select cell B2, go back here, comment that out, and let us go to activate a range. So I'm going to do it here when cell B2 is selected. It seems just like select. Everything's good, right? Well, let's go ahead and select cell A1. Run the macro. The range is not selected. Just because it worked with a single cell doesn't mean it's going to work with a range. And that's the thing. If you are using activate and you're trying to activate a range and you had a different cell selected the whole time, so you're like, okay, great, everything is working. It's not working. It's just making you think it's working. Once you have the upper leftmost cell selected before you go to run it, it's not going to select the entire range. And that's why here I've got a nice little note, activate a range, bad idea. And then this is, if you download the tutorial, you don't have the video to watch, you should be able to understand why this is a bad idea. Try this with the upper left cell in the range selected and with any other cell selected. So here's the problem with activate and select is that people use it with one cell and they think everything is all hunky-dory, all good to go because it seems to work the same, but it doesn't. So now I'll just quickly show you with multiple ranges, and you can imagine that the exact same thing will happen. So here's with select, no problem. We had A1 selected already, but it didn't matter. It selected everything that we wanted. All right, comment you out, and we'll do activate again with upper leftmost cell selected. Seems like it's all okay, right? Because we already had it selected. But now let's go back down here, do this again. Bam. Select away from the upper leftmost. Okay. So you should see now why you should not be using activate for ranges. Now, activate has some useful purposes, especially when you're moving between worksheets and when you are moving within a range. So let's talk about activating a cell within a selection. This is a commonly used example, and it illustrates how you can use both of these together. So here, what we're going to do is select range A1 to C3, but then we will activate a cell within that selection. Let's go here. So we want to select this range, and then we want this dude right in here to be highlighted. And now the active cell is cell A1, but if we wanted to make it something else, we could just hit enter and change the active cell like this. Now B2 is the active cell. So let us run the macro, and it should do that for us. Now we have A1 to C3 selected with B2 as the active cell. So if I begin typing, it will type in that cell. And when I hit enter, it goes to the next active cell within the selected range. I showed you this example just so I could show you that you can have an active cell within a selection and use those two together. But I've got to say, when you are building more complex macros, you will rarely use that. So this dude right here, yes, you can do it, but it's really not often used. So before we move on to the next macro, just remember, select is for multiple cells, multiple ranges, multiple, okay? Activate is for a single one. And whichever cell is activated is the cell that the user, if they start typing, will then be inputting data into. Now I talk about the user there because even though it's a little beyond this tutorial, you don't have to activate or select cells in order to input something into them when you are within the macro. So in another tutorial, I specifically show you and try to sort of beat this into your brain that once you build your macros, you will almost never ever use activate or select unless you are trying to draw the user's attention to a certain part of the worksheet. So select and activate have their place. You just won't use them too much when you get more complicated with things. All right, so I'm going to stop talking about this so that I do not make it any more confusing, and let us go to user selected ranges. So this is if you want to select or activate something with your macro. But the next one is where it's going to be more often used, this sort of scenario, which is when the user does it. So let's say the user selects a cell and you want to get the input from that cell, or selects a range and you want to apply formatting to that range. Well, that's where this comes in handy. It's the next macro here, user selected ranges. And what I've done is I've made it so that you've got 2 lines for every example. And the first one is going to select the cells just as if the user had done it using their mouse. And the very next example will open up a little pop-up window, message box, so it'll show you the address result for selection versus active cell in the very next example. And there you'll start to see the differences. All right, so let us begin. And I might not uncomment the lines for the range selections just because I can do that right now and show you. I just want to leave it in there so if you download the workbook, you can have an example that makes sense for what I'm going to show you here. So selection.address, let's hit Alt F11, select A1, Alt F8, select the second macro, OK, run. And we see the cell address A1. All is hunky-dory, and I bet you can imagine that it's going to work just the same for a single cell for active cell. A1. So as you can imagine, it will start to change when we do the ranges. So A1 to C3, I'm just going to go ahead and select that right now. A1 to C3, okay. A1 to C3, just like we expected for selection. So selection seems to be the one that you're going to want to use here. Active cell, let's try that dude out. A1. So once again, we're dealing with the upper leftmost cell with active cell, just like we did with activate. Now, that said, it is not always the upper leftmost cell. When you are using a macro to select a range, so the first part of this tutorial, it will always be the upper leftmost cell because that's what it's dealing with, right? So if you have the upper leftmost cell selected, it's not going to select the range. We don't use activate for ranges, remember? But when the user selects a cell, it's not always the upper leftmost cell. It is the active cell. So it's this little dude that's white right here. So if I go ahead and hit enter, and now I hit Alt F8 and run the macro, the active cell is cell A2. So the active cell can change for user-based selections. And you're going to see that as we progress further through this. Multiple ranges. This is kind of an interesting output here, and I'm going to go ahead and uncomment this so I don't have to select these cells individually. So Alt F11, Alt F8, run it. You can see the first part of the macro selected all the cells right there, and here we have the output. It's kind of an interesting output, so we get the first range, then a comma, then the second range, which is a single cell here, E4, then comma, then the third range. If we go back here, and let's comment this, go to the active cell, once again, just like when we had an individual range, by default, it's going to be the upper leftmost cell when we run it like this. However, so A1, however, the user, if they were to select this, it would go like this. Let's see if I can get the same cells. And this. So the active cell would actually be A5. Go back here. Let's take out the range selection. And now run the macro. We get A5. And now let's wrap it up with an example that will hopefully most clearly illustrate everything we've been talking about. So let us select a range A1C3, then activate the cell B2, then use one message box to output the address for the selection and one for the active cell. Let's click away. So for the selection, we get A1 to C3, as you see here, and for the active cell, it is B2. So this is a good example to run, a good little version of the macro, so that you can see both of them working together. And I know that this is a complicated topic, not because it's difficult to put here in the macro, it's just kind of difficult to understand when to use which one. So remember the most basic premise, select multiple cells ranges, activate a single cell. Selection for everything the user has selected, active cell for a single cell, the active cell in the selection. So that's it for this tutorial, and I hope that I have been able to make it at least a little bit less confusing. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.